Hi, everybody. Welcome to the American Library in Paris. I am Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of cultural programs here, and I'm very pleased to be here this evening and to welcome all of you here for a special event. We're partnering with the Overseas Press Club to discuss the results of the US elections. I just have one minor technical point, which is we're having a little bit of internet issues here at the library. If the Zoom connection cuts out, we're very sorry. It should kick back in, so be persistent and log back in. And thank you for bearing with that. I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. We have, starting here on my left, Richard Fausset from the New York Times. He's based in Atlanta and writes about conservative politics, and he's covered Trump's campaigns. He's focused on the politics of the South, gun ownership, race, and poverty. Behind me on the Zoom, we have Vivian Salama of the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, Vivian. She has been on the campaign trail all year and covered Trump's first term. She's reported from about 85 countries, including as AP's Baghdad bureau chief, and she's been based in the UAE, Pakistan, Egypt, and Israel-Palestine. She's also an attorney and a member of the District of Columbia Bar, so welcome to Vivian. Sylvie, yes, we can have as much applause as you want. Sylvie Kauffmann here from Le Monde. She's a columnist for Le Monde and the paper's former editor-in-chief. Kauffmann was previously a longtime foreign correspondent with postings in the US, London, Moscow, and Singapore. Ben Barnier from France Info TV. He's a senior correspondent for France Télévisions News Channel, and he co-anchored a nightly program on air during the campaign's final weeks and covered the Trump campaign. Barnier previously worked for ABC News and is a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism. And finally, to moderate this evening's panel, we have Vivienne Walt, who is Paris correspondent for Time and Fortune magazines. She has reported from dozens of countries across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East for Time and Fortune. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, and other publications. She is a governor of the Overseas Press Club of America, the US's oldest organization for foreign correspondents. So a big round of applause for all the panelists. They're going to be in discussion for about an hour about the experiences of the campaign trail, and then we're going to open up to questions from you in the audience for about half an hour. So this is an exceptional event in that it will run 90 minutes. Thank you all for coming, and here we go.
Hi all, thank you. Oops, am I on? Hello, hello. How's this? Oh, there we go. Thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday night. And thanks to all the panelists for being here. I am reminded that the very, very first panel we ever had at the library, co-hosted by the Overseas Press Club, was after Donald Trump's victory in 2016. And I think there was a room of just shell-shocked, traumatized people. It felt like a kind of therapy session. And the atmosphere feels somewhat different this time. I think there's much more of a kind of, feeling of just getting on with things. That is one thing I think that would be good to talk about. But to begin, I would like to go quickly around the room and among the panelists and maybe pick out one moment on the campaign trail which really jumped out at you as being a kind of aha moment in which you had a glimpse of what ultimately would turn out to be the result, and in which you thought the Democrats seemed to be heading for a big loss. Vivian, I'll throw it to you first in DC. And hi, by the way.
So it's not so often we have two Vivians on a panel, so I feel very lucky to be here with you all. It's a really easy answer to that question. The debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump seemed to, at least temporarily, indicate that Donald Trump was headed for a victory. Certainly here in DC, and those of us who cover politics based in the US, it just seemed like that was the direction things were going. But Joe Biden's debate performance halting is a nice way to put it. it really kind of sealed the deal. And we felt like this was not going to go in Democrats' direction. Obviously, things changed in the months after that, and we can talk about all kind of the ups and downs. But there was never really a clear moment after that where we were like, maybe the Democrats will win, except maybe the last 2-3 days of the election. There was a sense that maybe women were turning out in greater numbers for Kamala Harris, and that maybe she could squeak by. But largely, those of us who were on the campaign trail felt that Donald Trump was very well placed. Maybe not for the sweeping victory that we saw, but at least for a victory. And so I would say the debate, everything kind of just went downhill after the debate.
Richard, I want to pass to you because you are based in the South. You live in the South. By the way, Richard is in Paris just for a few months. We're really lucky to have him here. But he's fresh out of the southern states of the U.S. Traveling around the South, did you get a feeling, as I did from way across the world, that the Democrats were simply kind of disconnected from some of the reality on the ground?
Sorry about that. I think there's, knowing that part of the country as I do. I grew up there, and all of my family's there now. There's always a sense that the Democrats are always outnumbered, always outgunned, and in a lot of places, especially outside of the big cities. So it wasn't surprising to me that the Democratic ticket was not going to do particularly well in a lot of the South. I was thinking about a moment where I thought the Democrats were in trouble. This was right when Biden said he wasn't going to run, and I ran out of my house in Atlanta, which is a very liberal city. The politics there are dominated by a really interesting kind of New South coalition of African Americans, some Hispanics, and liberal whites. And I ran to Auburn Avenue, which is about a mile from my house, which is this wonderful street. It's this kind of African American high street. It's one street parallel from Sweet Auburn, which is where MLK is buried and Coretta King is buried. It's a very fascinating part of town. It's a great place to party at 2 a.m. It's sort of hip, but very black, very sort of culturally black. And I talked to a few people, and this one young man I talked to was on a smoke break. He was a cook at a restaurant, 28 years old, African American, had a couple kids. And I asked him what he thought, and he was like, well, I was never going to vote for Biden. He was too old. And I guess that was a common refrain in the media and kind of in the street. But it was really interesting to me coming from this person, because I think, a lot of times the conversation is where I live is dominated by white liberals, African American sort of power brokers. And for them, they're judging this election on a very different kind of scale than this young man is. They're thinking, well, one man, was behind this effort to overturn his election loss, which is this sort of, cardinal sin. And for this guy, he was just like, I don't know, Joe Biden's too old. I was going to vote for Trump. Now I'll give this new lady a try, but I guess. So you really felt like there were these different conversations going on, even in kind of even in that world.
Just before I turn to other panelists, I want to just interject my own thought here. And I was not on the campaign trail. I was sitting in Paris, but I did watch, obviously, intensely what was going on, especially the Democratic National Convention, which seemed to be such a high point. But along with that high point, at least for me, I kind of had this very uneasy feeling that it was very populated by, super glitz, celeb, a sort of firepower, a kind of sense of everybody being just so really self-congratulatory in a way. And I think it might have been summed up by one of Kamala Harris's applause lines, actually, when she said, in many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man. And I thought, that really doesn't sound good in the ears of many Americans. Does that mean that, like, their politics are not serious, their complaints are not serious? And I want to get both of your, Sylvie and Ben's, responses to this. You're both French, you're not American, you're looking at this and maybe hearing things from a different kind of prism. Ben, you spoke to me before we came on stage about this incredible atmosphere around the Trump rallies that you were at in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was on the campaign trail quite a bit in different states. And there was, maybe if I may, just talk about one moment that really struck me, which was at the end, actually, on election day. We were in Mar-a-Lago, right in front of the whole complex, and you see on TV, it seems like a lot of people, but it's not that many people. But the people that are there are the hardcore supporters, and that spent all evening, part of the night there, and we've interviewed anyone we could find, and we're live on TV. And there's this guy who's been like screaming all night long, hearing the news on the radio, so excited because Trump's winning. And so I finally get to him, and I know he's going to be like a good guest. He's going to have a lot of things to say. So he's talking about many issues, and at some point it goes into something personal and say, I'm gay and I'm Latino and I'm so excited about Trump winning. And I'm like, oof, let's just stop. Let's just stop for a minute, because I got people watching this back in France. They will not understand. They just, what you're saying makes no sense to the people that are watching you in France. You're gay and you're Latino. You shouldn't be voting for France. That's what people are going to, for Trump. That's what people are going to think in France. And he's like, you know what? I'm gay, I'm Latino, but I'm also American. And fuck you, I'm voting for whoever I want.
So, Sylvie, in the eyes of Europeans, and you speak to a lot of very important ones, Trump has for years appeared to be this kind of really unreconstituted, just completely beyond the pale. Is there kind of now a sense that we're going to have to deal with him as a, major world leader who's going to leave his mark on history, not just as a little blip that kind of came out of nowhere and is going to disappear again?
Yeah. Well, before I answer your question, I would like to address your previous question, maybe about the moments in the campaign. I didn't cover the campaign as you. I was in the same situation as you. I was in Paris, so I watched a lot on TV, and there were moments where I was surprised by. Of course, when Biden was running, for me, it was a done deal, yeah. But then when Kamala Harris started her campaign, the one thing surprised me first. It was the media, and of course the media I watch or I read, which mostly probably you would qualify as liberal media. They were suddenly as enthusiastic about Kamala Harris as they were critical of her before. Yeah, she was always described as a failed VP, and she didn't make a mark, and suddenly she was, wow, this wonderful star, especially after the Democratic Convention, the show she put and everything. And I thought, how can they switch so quickly from this is bizarre, right? Well, that was one thing. But I thought she was making a great campaign. I thought the convention was fantastic. It was so quickly organized, and it was well done, and it was successful. And, she did put all this energy and this enthusiasm again into the Democratic Party. So that was nice. There was a moment when, like many Europeans, I thought she had a good chance to win. And I told you before that I thought there was a lot of wishful thinking also on our part here. But there was one moment when I thought, probably Biden blew it. It was the garbage thing. His blunder about this when this controversy about the comment made by somebody at one of Trump's rallies that it was full of garbage.
Which you were at, Ben.
Right? Yeah, I was very lucky.
And then Biden made this comment, and I thought, that this is so stupid. It's going to be really to reflect very badly on her. So then I realized that she didn't have such a good chance to win. Now, turning to Trump, it's very complicated, our relationship in Europe with Trump, because we hate him, basically.
He's on his way to Paris.
Most politicians or most leaders really dislike him intensely and wish that he wouldn't win. But then, of course, they are going to try to have a very good relationship with him. So, they really had a hard time during his first term. Some of them were so badly treated. You remember Angela Merkel. Fortunately for her, she's not here anymore. She's not in power anymore. But he was going to be exactly the same with Scholz, and Macron now has his chance. He's doing just like the first term. He invited him very early on to the Bastille Day parade. You remember that Trump wanted to do the same on Pennsylvania Avenue, and so now he has him not for the big event at Notre Dame. So we'll see if it works again.
Can I just add one thing with the French? Again, I'm not giving my opinion. I'm just a field reporter who spent a lot of time with Trumpists. But I want to add something about what you said, the relationship between France and Trump. Because it's true that everybody says, they hate Trump, but I brought you some small thing. I clearly spent too much time with Republicans. I was coming with the trick. And it's this, right? I have 6 of those at home. The cleaner at home must think I'm running a shop or something. The reason is that online, I get requests for those things from French people, from probably left-leaning people. And I'm up to a point where I tell those people, you guys make no sense, because you say you hate Trump, but you never request a Kamala mug or a Biden hat. I've never had those requests. And they say, no, c'est pour rigoler, it's just for fun. But at the end of the day, I'm not saying they like Trump, but I'm saying there might be something complicated in the relationship. There's certainly some fascination.
Fascination,
that's for sure.
exactly.
Yeah. But they're spending money on this, because I don't give them for free.
I think what's clear, and I'm sure every American in this room, of which there are many, must have this sense, is that it's not one country. It really depends where you are. I spent the last couple of weeks of the election campaign in California with my family, and, of course, there's not a single Trump sign anywhere in sight. I'm not sure what would happen to you if you try to put one in your front yard. And actually, one of the yard signs that really jumped out at me, so it's Northern California, the Bay Area, was Harris Waltz, obviously, underneath, obviously. In other words, what idiot in the world would ever vote for Trump? And I think that kind of speaks to a certain, what I had said before was a sort of disconnectedness from there. It is not one country, and maybe less and less so as we all watch different things, read different things, speak to only those who we agree with, etc. So, Vivian, I want to get back to you. Actually, there you are in the camera. I need to look at the camera, not at the screen. I'm interested from the point of view of Washington. I think for a lot of us who are far away, there's a kind of terrifying aspect to all of this, which is, will the country still be the same? Will we still have a Congress that is able to, exercise some accountability and have, actually reject nominees that are, beyond confirmability, or are things going to be after 4 years, another 4 years of Trump, kind of, you know, an unrecognizable country that's going to take many years to get back to where we were.
Before I get to your question, you just mentioned the Harris-Walz obviously sign. I mean, I was traveling in parts of the country where I was seeing signs that said any sane adult as a political signs. And so that was sort of the mood going into this election a little bit, certainly before Vice President Harris joined the race. As far as the mood and how everything is shaping out, I've been really surprised. You know, I've been taking stock a lot. I'm meeting with like top Biden officials in the last couple of weeks since the election to talk to them about how they're feeling as well. I mean, my full-time job is covering the Trump transition at the moment, but you know, certainly haven't lost touch with the Biden officials. You know, just the kind of establishment Democrats that are here in town who hold very senior roles. And I've been pretty surprised at the muted panic among Democrats here in DC. I think the sense is we survived 4 years of Trump. We're going to survive another 4. Just hold your nose and let's get through this. And there is definitely that belief, certainly a little bit less panic than what we saw in 2016, where he had no track record and people believed that you know, that doomsday was upon us essentially if they did not support Trump. Now, there is a flip side to that, in that as he has been naming his nominees for different cabinet positions, and we're seeing sort of how his administration is going to take shape or potentially going to take shape. A lot of them are problematic and may not even make it to confirmation hearings. There is some worry about certain agencies being weaponized. And that is not something to brush aside as that's not a minor issue, obviously. We're talking about key agencies like the Department of Justice, the FBI, you know, even some of the financial arms of the country, the Pentagon, even. And there is concern about that. What is more concerning to people is that he does come in with experience this time. And so what we are seeing this time around versus the last time is that he and his team have familiarized themselves with the levers of government in a way that they can then shape the government according to their will. Now, at first, Trump nominated several individuals who brought calm actually to DC. Certainly on the Hill and elsewhere, they felt that they were capable professionals, they were experienced professionals. Someone like Senator Marco Rubio, who's been nominated as the foreign, as the Secretary of State, you know, he was chosen among a number of people who were viewed as far more extreme than him. And so when Rubio was nominated, even Democrats were, you know, saying, oh, it could have been a lot worse. We'll take Rubio. He's a professional. He's hawkish. He's conservative, but he's a professional. But then we've kind of come to a point where there were other positions that he has chosen, sort of these MAGA loyalists, people who are much more in line with the far right viewpoint. And there is concern that he comes in with a grudge because of the impeachment inquiries against him in the first administration, but also certainly the indictments and convictions that came when he was out of office. And so the Justice Department in particular is going to be one that we look at very closely going forward, and whether or not that becomes a weaponized tool for a second Trump administration. People here are nervous, but they're also, again, like I said at the very beginning, cautiously optimistic that we were able to sort of survive 4 years, and you know, the bureaucracy sort of proved stronger than the man, and you know, the government kind of remains standing, and so it will again. But it's hard to say at this point. You know, there are interesting individuals that have been chosen for his cabinet. It all depends on whether they get confirmed, and that's going to boil down to just a very small handful of Republican senators who will have to make that decision. So stay tuned.
Richard, I want to ask you, from your home turf, Georgia, it was supposed to be, you know, a real swing state, and was the real sort of beacon of hope 4 years ago.
For Democrats.
Right, for Democrats, right. In your view, just knowing the South as well as you do, and especially Georgia, which is in some ways emblematic of a lot of places of America, what went wrong for Democrats? And was it, as some people believe, just like maybe failing to grasp like how much pain people were in economically and maybe even culturally?
Well, it's a wise person said to me a few years ago that it's the nature of swing states that they're going to swing. You know, you're up one year, you're down the other year, and some of this comes down to personality. It comes down to just this very moment in time. A state like Georgia, I think, is very emblematic of that. We may, you know, the conditions may be a little bit different next time, and the Democrats may have a lot more luck. A lot of the underlying issues and the underlying reality of Georgia remains the same. I think it's generally a center-right state, but there is measurable demographic change, and there was also a measurable distaste for Donald Trump in the northern arc of suburbs around Atlanta, which had become a very important part of American politics. This is essentially where Newt Gingrich launched his Republican Revolution in the 1990s. It was kind of a mix of kind of rednecky and then white flight Republicans, country club Republicans, and some more rural-ish Republicans. I say redneck with a lot of love because, like I said, all my people are from this part of the world. So a lot of that changed with Donald Trump in 2016, and we saw it all the way through. Especially with college-educated women. The issue that really interests me about this potential, about this incoming administration, is what Trump voters expect of what appears to be, by choice, is going to be a very disruptive government. I think, and I love this idea of, F you, we're Americans, we're going to do what we want. I learned this psychological concept, this very French, l'appel de vide, which means like when you're driving on the road and you think this voice in your head says, don't jerk the steering wheel and go off the cliff. But then you go, ooh. Maybe I'm going to jerk this steering wheel and go right off the cliff. And in the same way, I think there's a very kind of like, among white voters in the place I come from, there's a lot of sort of this, oh, don't press the button. Oh, I'm going to press this button right now. This kind of cussedness, this kind of sense of. But what does that really mean? I mean, what does it mean now for people for this trend? I think of dissolving the line between church and state. American Baptists were the biggest proponents of the separation of church and state, because I'm sure there's a lot of Protestants in this room. You guys fight and you argue and you splinter, and the Baptists took very seriously this idea that, no, we're going to take care of our beliefs and we don't want the government intruding. This all changes right around the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency, if I have my history right. The Southern Baptists, the largest denomination in the country, started aligning themselves with the Republican Party. But the reality is, in a lot of parts of the South, beyond the coasts, we really don't know what pushing the button for this kind of government means. In West Texas, Friday Night Lights, football is such a big deal. Well, who puts up the football teams? Public schools. And what are some of the most conservative and some of those powerful and rich Texans trying to do right now? Dismantle the public education system, which doesn't just give you football. It also gives you a lot of salaries, and not just for teachers. It's for all the back end people who support teachers and who build buildings for public schools. I think that all of the ways in which whatever this next thing is going to become, is a huge mystery even for the people who voted for it. Maybe there's an element of that in any kind of political movement, but it feels particularly strong in this one.
Sylvie, I wondered if what you might think of the ripple effects of a Trump, no matter what you think of Donald Trump, the accomplishment of having pulled off this election is quite something, given, his 32 felony convictions and the rest of it. And I'm wondering, in Europe, I have not heard quite the celebratory cheers as you heard in 2016 from Marine Le Pen and many other kinds of leaders. There were, of course, messages of congratulations, but you didn't see the kind of giddy enthusiasm as you did 8 years ago.
Well, of course, when we say Europe, it's easy to say Europe, and Europe is divided, as you know. And so when I said we hate him, of course, it's not everybody in Europe who hates him. It's people who and politicians or leaders who wish that Kamala Harris or Democratic president had won. But I would say Viktor Orban was really happy about this election. He went to visit Trump in Mar-a-Lago in July, I think, and really said that he wished he would. He was sure actually that he would win, and that would be great for Europe. So. There are a few leaders who I'm sure were happy. But the problem also is if you take somebody like Giorgia Meloni, whose party
Italian
is
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister of Italy, whose party we consider as belonging to the far right here, you would think that she would be very happy, but as you said, she didn't particularly celebrate it because for Europe it's going to be difficult, and we know that by experience because the first term was really difficult for Europe, for NATO, for Europe, for trade relations. Of course, there's this threat of tariffs, which are going to make life really difficult for everybody, even if there are no tariffs for Europe. The tariffs for China will probably imply that goods from China will flood the European market if they cannot access the American market, as we see already with the electric vehicles. So we know it's going to be difficult. And then the difference, really huge difference between now and the first term, we have a war going on in Europe. And so there we don't know what's going to happen. And that's very interesting because Trump said, I will solve this in 24 hours, but everybody, of course, knew that it wouldn't be possible. But there are mixed views about this. Even the Ukrainians, even within the Ukrainian leadership, there were people who were so disappointed by the hesitations and the policy of Biden, even though there was a lot of aid provided to Ukraine by the US. But, they thought they were always half measures and, that they would, that the policy of the United States under the Biden administration was to help the Ukrainians enough for them to defend themselves, but not to win the war. So in those circles, you really had people saying, with Trump, it might be easier. He was the one who gave us or sold us the first Javelin, the anti-tank missiles in his first term and so on. So, the thing is that since he's been elected, he hasn't said anything really about how he was going to solve this issue. But as Vivian was saying, the appointments he made on the foreign policy are different from the ones he made for domestic policy. So, there may be some hope about what will happen in this field.
I feel like we should spend just a little bit of time, and I want to ask you, Ben, and then you, Vivian, about not just how Trump won, but how Kamala Harris lost. And Ben, from your point of view, having been at all of these rallies, gone around, spoken to people, what were they saying about Kamala Harris? Clearly, she had virtually no time to, emerge as a candidate. But what were they saying? Were their first impressions, or reasons why they might not vote for her?
Right. I mean, I think it's best to talk about Democrats, because if you talk about Republicans, of course, they hated her, but they would have hated any Democrat. So, that's something to take in consideration. I think one thing that she didn't have was a primary. And as brutal as a primary can be, at least it's going to establish her and it's going to prepare her for the second fight against the Republicans. She really missed that, and I think she could never recover from that. So that's one big thing, which is not from the field, but I think is important to mention. She had very little time to campaign, and she didn't go through that process, which makes you more legit once you've been there. And I think if we remember the Obama campaign, first Obama campaign, nobody thought he was going to be nominated for the Democratic Party, and when he did, we're like, okay, if he managed to defeat Hillary Clinton, then maybe he can beat anyone. Apart from that, what I saw on the campaign trail was a lack of people at the rally and a lack of creativity. Lack of people. I remember going to a rally in Harrisburg, which is the capital of the state of Pennsylvania.
Kamala rally,
Kamala Harris. And the place was not empty, but it was not packed. Anyone could get in. You didn't need any special ticket. Again, if you compared it to what I saw, not just at the Madison Square Garden rally, but also in small rallies in Pennsylvania, in Allentown, for instance, where the place was fully packed, plus thousands of people waiting outside, which I have seen personally. I didn't see that for Kamala Harris rallies. The other thing I saw more exciting, going back to Obama, when Obama was in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, for instance. It might have to do with John Legend and Bruce Springsteen. But still, when he came, and on that rally, Kamala was not a part of it. When Barack Obama went on stage, everybody felt better about themselves. So did I. I felt like, if you told me, let's walk to Mexico, okay, we walk to Mexico with you. He had something, I don't know what it is, whether it's charisma, whether it's the fact that he was a former president, but I didn't see that same level of devotion with Kamala, which you saw with Trump. People would follow him to the ends of the world. For the lack of creativity, when you're on the campaign trail, you not only do you cover rallies, but you watch the ones you're not covering on TV. So you get to hear the speeches so many times that you only pay attention when there's something new, right? And I think that Trump figured that out. That's how he came with those ideas that are basic and stupid, but the garbage truck, all those things are like, oh, excitement, something new. I mean, I guess we all live in Paris or in France. We all have a lot of time off and vacation. But when you're in the US, people have little time. They're not that interested in politics at the end of the day. You need to keep them busy and excited. And Trump gets it, with those little pictures and little Elon Musk, IA cool things on Twitter. And you're like, even though you might be working 12 hours a day, oh, that keeps you excited and interested. And even we have a daily show about the US election on France Info. There were always new elements from the Republican side and not that many new elements from Kamala. And I remember, for instance, the rally in Harrisburg, it was really a copy and paste of what I've heard on TV. She gave a few messages for locally elected people, but I felt she had a hard time catching the moment and just finding something to keep me and to keep people interested.
Vivian, I wanted to ask you, now that you have spoken to a lot of Democrats in Washington, was there, under these circumstances, any way that Kamala Harris or anyone could have won with a 100-day campaign, or was this simply just an impossible feat and a mountain that nobody could actually climb?
It depends on the person, right? There are certain individuals that generate a lot of excitement. She did briefly, in part because she just was not Joe Biden. And so there was a lot of enthusiasm for her candidacy in that regard. But, the Democrats had a few problems going in. Their communication strategy was extremely flawed. And you just touched upon it with her speeches and things like that. She wasn't made available for media interviews for literally months into the short campaign. I mean, I think it was a month and a half maybe. And the same for when she chose Tim Walz as her running mate. He was shielded off from the media, whereas Donald Trump was going out there every day talking to the media and just flooding the zone with information and taking up space and taking up attention. And that was really a big part of it. They were too careful. And it's in part because that structure was built around Joe Biden, who they had this intense kind of force field or shield around. And they do at his White House too, in part in the early days, because he was very, he had a high tendency to make blunders and to say things that he shouldn't say. And so they wanted to kind of manage the message. But then as he got older, they were also kind of shielding him because of that, as his age deterioration kind of advanced. And so that was one thing. The other thing, I mean, and I'm flipping the question around to talk about what Republicans did right, is they had a message. They had a clear message, and they stuck to it religiously. The economy is in shambles, and immigration is going to destroy America. Truth be damned, Trump was not always accurate in his depictions of either of these issues, but he hammered it repeatedly over and over again. And the fact of the matter is, the immigration message resonated with a lot of people. I remember literally being in Wisconsin at a rally and talking to people. I think it was actually a J.D. Vance rally, talking to people at this rally in a farm town in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. And I would ask people, what's the most important priority for you? And they'd say immigration. And I joke with them and say, from where? Canada? Because they are literally so far away from the Mexican border. But the issue has resonated so deeply with a lot of people, not just conservatives, but especially conservatives. And Trump has really used that as a core to his campaign message. And then the other thing, of course, is the economy, which, despite the fact that basic economic indicators were actually in Joe Biden's favor, unemployment was down, and there were a number of other indicators that were kind of favorable as numbers. Inflation has been killer in this country for several years now, and people feel that burn. It doesn't matter if you have a job, if you can't afford groceries and your house payments, you're going to feel that. And inflation has been crippling here in the country for the last couple of years. And the Trump campaign seized on that. And those were the core two messages that they hammered. Democrats did not have a core message. They started with sort of Trump is a threat to democracy. And then they kind of wavered about what core issues they were going to hammer. They had her kind of going out there and giving her whole spiel about all the different things that she would do as president. And that's important when you have more time. But, you really do want to, she was stuck in this difficult position of having such a short campaign that she had to kind of put her whole portfolio out there, try to distinguish herself from Joe Biden while still being his vice president. And this was a very sensitive issue throughout her, whatever it was, 100-something days, is that she needed to be a change candidate, but she could not just go out there and say, I'm different than Joe Biden. I'm not. It literally took her until 2 weeks before the election to bluntly say, I'm not Joe Biden. And by that time, it was too late. All those issues that I mentioned, immigration, the economy, and a couple of others too, Republicans hammered issues like transgender rights and transgender issues and things like that. I mean, there were many other fringe issues. But the economy especially, I would say, resonated with people who were outside of Trump's typical demographic. And that is why he did so well on election night, is because women, Hispanics, Black voters, all of these people have been feeling the pain of the economy, and they saw Kamala Harris as a continuation of the policies that have been hurting them for the last couple of years. And so it was done.
It does seem, Richard, I know you want to jump in here, but
Please.
just two things. The one is, it seems more than just simply the economy, it's inequality, because
that's a big part of it.
New York and Washington, whatever, San Francisco, what are they talking about? The stock market's booming, right? But of course, that's not the economy that the great majority of people live in. And the other thing on immigration, I just was listening to a podcast with some of the Democrats who made the point that it actually, even in Wisconsin, yes, you're not anywhere near the Mexican border, but the opioid crisis has worked its way right through America and was something that the Democrats appeared to downplay.
Completely. And there's also been issues with busing migrants to Democratic cities and things like that, or different parts of the country. I mean, I'm not saying that the issue is without merit. Trump was not always truthful in how he depicted the issue, but it's not that it wasn't without merit. It's an enormous crisis, which until a couple of months ago was really at a peak. And then Joe Biden passed an executive order and things got a little bit better. But I mean, this has been a crisis that has plagued several administrations. And that's the irony, really quickly, and then I'll let you guys jump in. That's the irony of so much of what Trump was hammering, is that these are issues that have spilled over several administrations. I went to Johnstown, a city in Pennsylvania, where Trump was enormously popular and had a rally. This is a charming city in the most beautifully positioned, geographically positioned part of Pennsylvania, with rolling hills, all of these Victorian style buildings. And the city is virtually abandoned because for several decades now, companies have gotten incentives to move their headquarters to different places in the country, in Texas and elsewhere. This was a big energy area in Pennsylvania where you had oil companies and things like that. They got incentives to move elsewhere. And so the jobs followed them, and these places completely crumbled and deteriorated. And Trump goes in there and he talks about revitalizing these industries, and the economy is in shambles. And that is exactly what these people want to hear. They're desperate for anyone to listen to them, even though some Republican administrations have failed them as well, Donald Trump's included.
Richard.
I was just going to say that these two issues, the economy and immigration, I think you make such a good point. I think they get, for a lot of conservative and conservative-leaning voters, to this very basic question about whether or not the Democrats are really speaking to the truth that people see before them. I mean, I think there's such a crisis, epistemological crisis in the United States right now for all kinds of reasons. A lot of it has to do with media, but when it comes to the economy, Democrats are saying, no, the economy's good. And you go to the grocery store and eggs are $7 when they were $2.50 or whatever it is. If I was, if you were to ask me why Trump won, it's very simple. If I was making half of what I was making now, I would be terrified to go to the grocery store and try to feed my children. It was, and yes, wages were up. I understand that. But we haven't had inflation like that. If there are any economists around, I'd love to be fact check on this. I don't remember it since I was a little kid, since the 70s. And it shocked people. So when the Democrats were saying, no, look, the Biden economy is good, they were like, eh? And then immigration, in the Southeast, and I'm sorry to keep returning to it, but it's interesting because, there was not a lot of migration, 40 years ago, with the exception of, Texas, Arkansas, of Latino people and people coming across the southern border. That's really changed a lot in my lifetime, and it's really changed the way a lot of things work in the South. A very dear person who's in my family spent many decades as a plumber. Is a very country person, a white man who ran a small crew of white country boys installing plumbing in big buildings. And after 2000, at some point, he told me he started noticing competition from Latino crews. And I find this fascinating because, you know, like with a big corporation, there are all these rules, like you're not to sort of against the concept of good old boyism, whoever's being the good old boy, black, white, or whatever. With smaller companies, it's different. I just had a lot of work done on my falling apart house, and there was the El Salvadoran Guatemalan crew who did the bathroom. There was the white good old boys with a huge Trump sticker on their biggest pickup truck who worked on my front porch. And then, because there's such a tradition of African-American bricklaying in the South, that a subcontractor who did this this brick staircase were African-American. So, you know, we like to think we're colorblind and blah, blah, blah. When you get down to this level where a lot of people working in a 10 or 12 person company, you can't really separate out the issue of, you know, kind of race and all this sort of stuff. You know, to this person who's very dear to me, who hung up his plumbing company in part because of the 2008 crash. It was also, and this is a very sweet, very not racist person who was sort of against the odds because he grew up in a very, very deep Georgia. Did he suspect that these Hispanic crews that he was suddenly competing against had some illegal immigrants? You know, he wasn't checking their cards. And he never talked about it in that way to me, but my guess is that he had a suspicion that that was so. So when liberals, Democrats, academics say, look, immigration is good for our country. These people are contributing to the economy. In many cases, they're paying taxes. You know, did that guy vote for Trump? I think the chances are very good. And I think it was, you know, a part of this broader sense that what you're hearing is not reflecting the reality that I'm seeing.
I think we are about to open to questions from those online and those in the room. There is so much more to talk about, particularly, of course, we haven't even gotten to discuss what now. You know, where do we go from here? When will we next see a Democratic president? And, you know, what do they need to do to win back America? But I'm sure that everybody has a whole lot of questions, so we'll throw it open.
Thanks. What impact, if any, do you think was made by the vice presidential candidates?
Do you mean Walz and J.D. Vance? Vivian, do you want to take that? Were they a plus or a minus or just neutral?
I can tell you for sure that JD was seen as a liability in the early days when he was selected because he had a couple of missteps. I had followed him pretty closely. I spent several days on the road with him at this time. And, you know, the very famous one, obviously, being this conspiracy theory that he perpetuated about Haitian migrants in Ohio eating people's house pets, you know, which was debunked multiple times, but then Trump kind of defended him and things like that. It got to a point where he was even speaking for Trump on issues like abortion. And Trump kind of threw him under the bus and was like, nobody cares who the vice president is anyway. They're voting for me, not for him. But then JD saved himself with his vice presidential debate against Walz. He performed extremely well in that debate. And after that, kind of won Trump's heart. Trump was not turning back after that. He had no questions about JD. And he even won some fans like on the campaign trail. People were going to see JD after that because they really were impressed by him. I don't think that Tim Walz had a moment like that. Obviously, his debate performance was not as good, and there were a couple of questions about his storytelling being, you know, whether it was lies or just, you know, lacking truth in his recollection of certain incidents in his life. And he had misspoken so many times that it was starting to cause trouble. He talked about, you know, his National Guard experience in a way that was kind of erroneous. He talked about being in Tiananmen Square at the time of the revolution, and he wasn't there. He had left 2 months earlier, and he forgot that he had left 2 months earlier. Things like that did not help him. But he was also sort of this nice guy, and I think Democrats, on the one hand, loved that about him. But when they saw how fierce their opponents were, I think they really wanted not so nice a guy to take on the Republicans. And so it actually might have been a shortfall for him to be that nice guy. And there were a lot of speculation about whether or not Vice President Harris made the right selection or not, but she always said she went with her gut. So at the end of the day, I think the impact of the vice presidential candidates is minimal, but those are the two people we looked at, and for their minimal impact, that's what we saw.
Yeah, maybe just a few ads about the vice presidents. What I think is that Tim Walz, remember him for the weird quote. Those are weird people, and he was off to a good start. But then I think the Tiananmen and being deployed, but not actually deployed to war zones, kind of killed him. And that added to the whole Trump machine with Temp and Tim, and all those two things kind of, I think, destroyed his message and credibility. I think it's just my opinion that had Trump known that it would have been a fight against Kamala and not Joe Biden, he would not have picked J.D. Vance. He had, and we talked about the inflation and the American dream. J.D. Vance had that for himself. He's got a real, climbed up, inside society story, and that was good, but I think not good enough. And I think part of we might call it political marketing or instinct from Trump was to bring, and we haven't talked about it, Elon Musk on the campaign, and he's clearly become like vice president number 2, not to say number 1, or I don't know, we might create some new job for him, but it kind of gave, because I think there was a moment when Kamala had a bit of, momentum, there was excitement, like young woman, smart, but he kind of killed that dynamic with Elon Musk, who came with Twitter, X, and so much power that way, and all the money, and that, you might call it craziness, freshness, whatever it is, but something to keep you busy and keep your attention.
Over there, and then over there.
Ben, for those who are covering all the Trump rallies, it just strikes me that living in France, where I've lived for many years, if a presidential contender had all of these, felony convictions and all of these charges against them, okay, they may not be in jail, but they wouldn't necessarily be the candidate for one of the main parties. They wouldn't last. No, but they don't. I mean, Fillon dropped out. They drop out. And what strikes me is, and when you're covering all of these rallies, clearly one of the questions you must be asking these folks is, okay, fine, immigration and economy, and you can't buy the eggs. But man, what about all of these charges against him? And what about all the convictions? And is all of this trumped up? So how are they responding to that? And I just want to ask another question about, because we have all the students here, the youth vote. I remember when Obama was running, the youth were mobilized. There was an electricity amongst the youth for Obama, and you didn't see that with Kamala, and you kind of saw that with Trump to a large extent. So I'm kind of curious what your take is on that. Thanks.
Anyone want to take that one? Richard, maybe?
Well, I think we were talking about this backstage a little bit, when this question of the Trump rallies and why they work. I mean, you asked a number of questions. I mean, one of them is a huge question is, why have people decided to overlook Trump's many flaws? Maybe that's the question I should address. I mean, there are so many reasons. I think people want to believe what they want to believe. And then I think that, of course, people are encouraged to believe only what they want to believe by new media ecosystems. My in-laws live in rural Georgia, and in my lifetime, you went to church, and you got information from your social circle and from your preacher, and then the Atlanta Journal-Constitution used to come out there an hour and 10 minutes out of town, and you would read that, and then you would watch the evening news. And you think about the range of information that you got. You were sort of interfacing every day as a citizen with a lot of people who didn't agree with you in the pages of the newspaper, the big city newspaper, and on television. You're being exposed to things probably in a much more neutral, content neutral, or opinion neutral way. Now, I mean, you can feel it. I mean, all those people in my family have no use for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution except for the sports page, and some of them don't even have to go there for that anymore. And so you can see there's so much talk of silos, information silos and bubbles. You can really see it there. I mean, you can see it in the liberal world as well. But I think this really allowed for, and I never underestimate the power of Rupert Murdoch and Fox News. I think it's an absolutely ingenious mechanism that it creates a universe, and it really creates this impermeable membrane of information when you see how extensive it is and how important it is in people's lives, how it's on in hotels and motels and all over the place, diners, you see how information was limited, and debate over these very important flaws of Donald Trump's were not really addressed, in some cases papered over.
Can I just insert 2 words on that question? There is a serious belief that the system is rigged by voters across the country. And they think that Trump was subject to witch hunts, both in terms of his legal battles and in terms of the impeachments he went through. There's an enormous distrust of the Justice Department and the media among a lot of Americans. And so all of that factored in. And so what you would think would be harmful to his candidacy actually catapulted it. I mean, it bolstered his candidacy. People were proud to wear his mugshot on their chests at their rallies, on their shirts at their rallies. It was a sign of someone who is basically, bigger than all of the system, bigger than the system. So they actually saw it as a strength.
So maybe part of the answer to this youth wave might be a kind of anti-establishment, as Ben was saying, sort of screw you, we'll do what we like. It's very thought-provoking. We had another question right here.
Yeah, hi. Great panel, by the way. Thank you. I'm curious, we're all here in Europe. I'm really curious to what extent you all think this maps onto, I've seen, articles trying to sort of say, well, this is reflective of some trend in the larger world. I'm curious how you guys see it mapping onto what's happening in Europe, and maybe more specifically in France. Is this a story of rising authoritarianism? Is it about just a general anti-incumbency mood? Or maybe even to put a finer point on it if you want, to what extent does a Republican Trump voter, right, resemble an RN voter here in France? Are those same trends at play?
Yeah, go for it, Sylvie.
It is a trend, yes, of course. And if you take it chronologically, you have Orban came in 2010. Actually, he came back. He was after a while. Then you had Brexit, right? No, before Brexit, 2015, you had the Poland, the Law and Justice Party, which won the election in 2015. Then you had Brexit the same year as you had Trump won. And then you had, Italy, you had the growth of Rassemblement National here, and Netherlands, you name it. Yeah, it's a widespread movement. So, but then the systems are different. So, of course, in America, it's much more powerful. First, you're a bigger country. And then your question about, you're absolutely right about some electing a president who has so much, so many, who had so many problems with the justice system. I think in Europe we haven't seen this yet. and I'm not sure we will see it. But these are different. Yeah, these are different political system and judiciaries, but and relation and the media system is also different. But the basic trend, I agree with you, is there. Yeah, and that's why we'll see what happens now in the relationship with Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find it quite instructive. I like every French election to go up north and talk to people. There are a few like little northern towns near the Belgian border, really, which is very much Le Pen country. And it's so interesting to go just 2 hours, get in your car, drive 2 hours north. It's a different country, and the way people talk there about power and the economy and the elites, and it sounds really extremely similar. There's so many echoes with what we've just seen in the US.
And immigration and the cost of living. These are also two major issues in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to jump in with a question, if I may. A question for Vivian Salama. You're covering the Trump transition team. What do you really think a second Trump administration will mean for NATO? And a question for Richard on the ground in the United States. Do you think we can walk back Trumpism to a more moderate form of conservatism? Or do you think that this has just gone so far, it's like a stronger drug and no one's going to go back to a weaker stuff?
So regarding NATO, I personally do not believe that Trump is going to blow up NATO. I don't think he's going to pull out. I think the people who are around him do not see that as a constructive option now that he has chosen certain people in his national security and as his foreign policy advisors. Many of these people I've known for years, and they are not opposed to being part of these multilateral organizations, but they do echo his sentiments about, reciprocity, paying your fair share. And I think you are going to hear a lot more talk about, meeting the quotas for NATO, the 2% defense spending quota. You're going to hear a lot more about sort of doing more for Ukraine, that Europe should kind of pick up the burden because the US should not be the one doing, the lion's share, even though the U.S. is doing the most because the U.S. is the one capable of doing the most. I think those days are probably over. You'll probably hear a lot more of, there's a lot more reciprocal talk, which, we saw even in the first Trump administration in terms of the way he engaged, not only with NATO, but with European countries on issues like trade. And the number of times I heard from Germans or French officials that he tried to engage in bilateral trade on certain issues that were very much restricted to the European Union. And he didn't really kind of comprehend that they couldn't just break from the European Union on these issues. I think you're going to see him pushing for a lot more reciprocity. And that includes with Ukraine. We've already heard talk of, loan, aid in the form of a loan where Ukraine would somehow have to pay it back. And so it's going to be very telling. I know for a fact that the Ukrainian National Security Advisor is in town, and he's going to be meeting with a number of not only Biden officials, but Trump officials as well. And it's going to be very telling what comes out of those discussions, because I think there will be hard ones to have. The thing is that I think a lot of Democrats also believe that we are at a point where hard discussions have to be had with the Ukrainians on some of these issues as well. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of shock when it comes to Trump's rhetoric on NATO from a lot of people here in the country, so long as he continues to back them to a certain extent.
Any other questions?
There's a second question. Yeah.
So really quickly, because I know there's a question back there. So I think that my guess is that Trumpism is a manifestation of something much bigger, which is the fact that the United States is in this really intense process now of blowing up the old categories of evolution and perhaps devolution. A shout out to Devo, anyone who grew up in the 70s, and of just dramatic change and reorganization in the way our politics works. The conservatives that I knew when I was a kid who told me to read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, it was Milton Friedman, and it was low tariffs, and it was very skeptical, if not hostile, toward Russian power. All that has been challenged by the Republican Party of today under Trump. But I think we're going to continue to see all kinds of fascinating changes and mutations. RFK Jr.'s stance on medicine and health is, it combines all kinds of stuff that we haven't seen before, and I think this is in some ways just an inevitable process. I don't know if it'll be good or it'll be bad, but you think about the Democratic Party in many of our lifetimes. Here was a party that literally contained white segregationists and a very loyal African American contingent clamoring for their very fundamental rights, and that we were just all like, yeah, sure, that's a Democratic Party. That did not hold, and so I think there's just a lot of fundamental instability in the two parties that are going to break up. The last thing I want to mention is this geographer Guyi, did I say his name correctly? Who's fascinating to me because he has this kind of concept that it's the France of the métropole versus the France of everybody else, and that it's a very controversial idea, but he believes that this explains much of our politics in the West, and if all of us are urban dwellers and consider ourselves to be urbane and liberal or whatever, blah 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 blah, there's this whole other world, and I think that maps certainly with the France that I've seen or I've read about and the United States, and I think it's worth considering, as we don't make as much stuff as we used to do, as information economies come to dominate. The old idea, somebody said the other day, well, the Democrats need to go back in the union halls, and I was like, wow, the union halls. I cover a very non-union area, and there are union halls, and they are important. But I thought, wow, that just sounds kind of archaic to me.
We have time for another few questions. So, there's.
Thank you. First of all, fantastic panel. I really appreciate your experience and expertise. It really kind of helped me to understand what's going on. I have a lot of questions about the election, but the most perplexing one for me, I hope to get your insight on. Now, I know that Biden wasn't running, it was Kamala Harris. I know Biden was perceived as being really old, and he had deteriorated. But yet, if you look at his record, he passed the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. He tried to reduce the burden of college loans to young people. I even think he walked the picket lines on behalf of striking union workers. I want a theory from you why all of that didn't translate into more support for him. He seemed to have lost ground with young people, with union workers, and people just concerned about inflation and jobs. Thanks.
Ben, you want to take a crack?
Or maybe answer, I'm sorry, almost as a politician, with two more questions on your question. For me, sort of the question is, inside your question is, who killed Joe Biden? Is it the Democrats or is it Republicans? Is it Donald Trump with a debate, which has been mentioned earlier, when he really hammered Joe Biden and in a very cruel way, saying, I don't understand what Biden just said, and I don't think he did either, which stayed in everybody's mind. I don't think we can, quote much more from that 2-hour-long debate other than that. And that sort of, harsh, violent demonstration of strength against Biden? Or is it this, I don't know what happened really, but with the George Clooney efforts and big, billionaires trying to shift the money towards Kamala? Because when she was, that sort of happened very quickly in a way. We sort of learned in the matter of 72 hours or something, that number one, Joe Biden was out of the race. Number two, donors were pretty keen on Kamala. And number three, Kamala was in and she had a lot of money. So that's the question I'm trying to figure out, and I hope that with reporting, with the insight we might get, might help us understand why, in a way, to try to answer your question, why Joe Biden was made inaudible. Was it efforts from Republicans or from the inside who didn't want him, maybe just because he was too old?
I think also, and maybe Vivian, you want to just jump in here for a minute. I think it's what you said, like the Democrats did not have a message. Things like, the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, people's heads were spinning. Nobody tuned into the election till like the week before. And they didn't hear that kind of Make America Great slogan from the Democrats.
There was definitely a little bit of that, and I would throw in two other theories on top of it. First, there were enormous blunders as well. I mean, the Afghanistan withdrawal early in the Biden administration was something that resonated with a lot of Americans. Just the images were so shocking of people falling off airplanes, and the troops that were killed, the American troops that were killed at Abbey Gate, that really tarnished that first year, on top of the economy, on top of all these other issues as well. That those accomplishments you listed, like CHIPS Act and other things, they don't really resonate with the average American. What does is like lowering food prices, that kind of thing. And then you see troops as well being killed. They took a hit for things like that. And then, the Republicans were very effective in also saying that Russia only invaded, that Joe Biden couldn't stop Russia from invading Ukraine, which of course is a very debatable point. But that was what he was accused. He was accused of being weak for that reason. And there was just sort of a series of issues like that on top of these bigger core issues like migration really spiraling out of control, like the economy. And then the second thing, and I would just say very briefly, is, we live in an era of television. I mean, going back to the John F. Kennedy Nixon debate, where people see and judge based on what they see. I think they saw an elderly man who really they couldn't relate to, and especially the increasingly the growing young population here in the United States. They saw this old man that they couldn't relate to. And it was something that they lost enthusiasm for the entire political process. And I think that played a role too.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Yeah, could I take a question here from the Zoom audience? Would that be all right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So let's see. Okay, here's one. It's kind of interesting. What influence do TV ads have in elections now versus the role of social media, specifically thinking of X, formerly Twitter? And I would add Blue Sky.
I'm not sure who on the panel would like to take this. What ads seem to make an impact, what didn't?
Maybe briefly on that. I think what we've seen, and we're going to see more and more of that, is that it seems like there's two markets. There's a first market, which are the commercials, and then a second market, which is the online buzz. And it seems kind of the same for speeches and rallies. It doesn't matter as much as what's being said during the rally or in a commercial, but who's going to pick it up and how it's going to be retweeted and retweeted again. So I think the commercials have an impact as long as they're being picked up by some accounts online and being repeated. I remember one of the ads earlier between Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump, and there was this ad. I don't know who's familiar with the fingers in the cake story on the plane, and Ron DeSantis was eating cake. He didn't have a spoon, so he ate the cake with his fingers. And that was turned into a commercial that was briefly on TV, but then was picked up by the account and was repeated and retweeted and had some kind of impact. The other difference too, I think, between TV commercials and Twitter, just to mention X, is that, and what we've seen in this campaign, I think more than before, I mean, tell me if you didn't get that impression, is that it's been more and more targeted towards not just states, but sometimes counties and parts of counties, so they could really put a lot of those precious millions, which they had many, and they were better, I think, at targeting the actual people they wanted swing to the other side.
I mean, I also did notice that, any gaffe obviously was immediately cut and made into an ad. The famous one of the famous ones being Kamala saying nothing comes to mind when asked how she was different from Biden. Within, 20 minutes, that was an ad. And
I used to have that ad repeated to me at a lot of the rallies, too. People used to repeat it to me constantly.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit on the same question. Of course, the swing states were supposed to swing. Yes. And all the swing states fought for Trump. Trump made inroads in young people, Black Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and I think the young leaders, the thought leaders, are very organized with Republicans. There is, I think, a site called Freedom Point or something like this, and they have trained hundreds of young leaders on the Republican, and they have money, and so the Republicans can put out information to everybody very quickly, whereas the Democratic, they didn't do anything. And that's from 8 or 10 years that the Republicans got organized. So the tools are there. What I don't quite understand is what about the content that the thought leaders use? Because I don't listen. I live in Paris now, so I don't really understand what they say. But the tools are there for the Republicans, not for the Democrats. But what about the content they used to people is just like always, immediately. And the young leaders, the thought leaders, there are people who talk to hundreds of thousands of people, and some of them even million people who listen to these. And on the Democrat, there may be 4 or 5 people, or maybe more, 6, I don't know, but very few.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, you see a big gap between the way that the Democrats are basically packaging their message and for the Republicans appear to be way more advanced in this. Richard?
There was does anybody remember Vladimir Zhirinovsky? He was this, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was this right-wing nationalist Russian leader who emerged around the time or after Glasnost. And there was a journalist who wrote in English who spoke good Russian, who wrote a story about him that stuck with me quite a bit. And he said, because people around the world are saying, well, wait a minute, you just got rid of this one kind of totalitarianism. This guy seems like a nut job. Like, what's going on? And this person who spoke Russian well said, look, you've got to understand, the Russian people have been sitting through hours and hours and hours of grain reports and just this boring Stalinist language. There was all of this stuff we'd heard over and over again, and it was just bullshit. And we all knew it was bullshit. And here comes Vladimir Zhirinovsky, also peddling bullshit, but with this direct, earthy Russian that's just throwing or chucking a rock, through this edifice of language that's been built by bureaucrats and whatever. And I think you have to think about Trump and the people who are around Trump in that same way. When he thinks something is bullshit, he says, that's bullshit. And he says a lot of things that are really unpleasant and are really scary. But I think that I know that a lot of people, when they hear this kind of language, which hadn't been heard for many, many decades, the people are careful, people are cautious when they're asked a question. Typically, in what was American politics. Now, Trump just goes out and he just says stuff. And I think a lot of people driving in their trucks, sitting around a dinner table, say, that guy, that makes sense. The language is different, it's more forceful, it's more vulgar. And I think it's something that the Democrats are trying to play catch up on. I think John Fetterman does it to some extent, He shows up in a sweatshirt and he just kind of goes off.
Bernie Sanders, maybe.
Yeah, Bernie maybe, but like it's it's something that the Republicans own right now. It's tied to new media. It's tied to podcasts. It's tied to, in some ways, to this bro culture that we should do a whole other segment on, that I think J.D. Vance plugged into, to the rise of very powerful sort of conservative-ish podcasters. They say what they want. They don't have to answer to anybody at all.
I would just add really quickly that what you're describing, sir, you have to consider that the actual reverse, it was flipped when Obama was elected twice. I think these things go in waves. The Democrats are basically having a come to Jesus moment right now, but Republicans were doing that when Obama got elected twice. And they had to really kind of do a lot of soul searching and figure out where their party was headed as well. So I think these things happen.
We are pretty much out of time. I will give one last 30 seconds to Sylvie and to Ben. Sylvie.
About what? About the last? No, I think we still have we still have democratic systems and we still have elections. So so wait for 4 years, but yeah.
We're waiting for our vulgar demagogue to emerge from the Democrats. Ben.
Just one quick point about the message. I remember covering the midterms in Texas, and we asked that question to people: what do Trump and Jesus have in common? And most people had no answer. And one lady, she said, maybe one thing: he speaks clearly.